Lawsome by Consultwebs. Breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm with your host, Tanner Jones.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have Matt Smyers, Digital Advertising Advisor at Consultwebs. Matt is a non-practicing attorney who brings more than a decade of experience in the legal marketing profession. He lives, breathes, eats, sleeps, everything you can imagine digital advertising for attorneys. We're finding today that really the only constant with respect to marketing online is change itself. And it's like painting a moving train with Google continuing to go by. So this is an exciting topic. Obviously, a lot's going on right now. And so, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Tanner. Great to be here. And thanks for that intro.
Absolutely. Well, I know you have a lot of experience in this field. And as I mentioned, things are constantly shifting. We've seen this evolution of local services ads finally hitting the legal profession over the last couple of years. And we've seen firms really starting to jump in and see some wild success in many instances. Other firms really seeing some big challenges with this. Now, keep in mind, there are other firms who've been investing in other aspects of digital marketing for years and years, whether that be pay-per-click advertising, search engine optimization, and other forms of search marketing. With the advent of local services ads, can you just speak to what are you seeing with the overall search landscape, and specifically what are attorneys seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, local services ads, not at this point, not a new product, but I think we now have enough time behind us with these ads to really have some data and some meaningful insight into how local services ads have impacted the search landscape, specifically for attorneys. And, you know, when the product was first released, I know there were a lot of folks that said this is the end of PPC, and I wasn't quite so sure about that. Obviously, Google makes money off of PPC. That's their primary bread and butter. So I didn't think it was going away entirely, and in fact it hasn't. But it's been very interesting for us to observe what has changed in that interplay between local services ads and pay-per-click, traditional pay-per-click or Google search ads. So, with pay-per-click, I think what we're seeing is that, there was a trend going on for quite some time that the larger firms really on a statewide and regional basis were really starting to dominate the pay-per-click landscape, and costs continue to rise. We still believe that it's a very effective advertising medium. You just have to be willing to pay a premium for those clicks, for those leads, and for those cases. And the firms that do it well and are able to scale it are still seeing tremendous success. But really what has happened, I think, with the advent of local services ads, obviously those large firms, large, budgets are now competing in the local services ad space. But I think what we're seeing is more of the smaller to mid-sized advertisers in each market are starting to actually gravitate away from pay-per-click and into local services ads because it is a lower risk proposition, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I think what that's done with PPC is now you have these large spenders that have always had a presence there are still there, and actually prices haven't gone down. Costs have continued to rise, and I think that's just a result, these larger firms continuing to battle for those clicks, leads, and cases that come from pay-per-click. Now, obviously, local services ads, given their prominent position, on the search page, are stealing some of those clicks, and leads and cases away from pay-per-click. So it'll be interesting to see, exactly to what extent. But I mentioned, smaller firms gravitating towards local services ads because it being a lower risk proposition. And that's primarily because of the cost. Google has made these a pay per lead as opposed to a pay per click, which in our experience has really eliminated quite a bit of potential waste and risk, at the risk of $125 to $100 or $200 per click in pay per click. Now the risk is mitigated with local services ads, because if you're paying for an actual lead. In our experience thus far, the leads have been very high quality. We haven't had firms cancel local services campaigns because they're spending too much money and not getting anything in return. So I think that's a pretty good indicator that the quality of these leads has been pretty high. So, overall, I'm convinced at this point that this product is here to stay. It is becoming more competitive, not surprising. More firms are jumping in. I think Google honestly is just now starting to figure out where they're going to make this product so it's not race to the top in terms of budget and spend, much like kind of the direction PPC had been heading for some time, and how to make sure that firms with even more modest budgets have an opportunity to generate leads and cases from it.
You hit on a couple things, and I want to kind of to walk through those. The one piece is just the risk. Obviously, all marketing comes with some level of risk, and that's what every business owner or every law firm owner has to consider when they're looking at any marketing opportunity. Well, speak to the differences. I mean, you touched on that, but speaking specifically to local services ads versus pay-per-click, and how do you compare the risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we just apply some simple math, right? So let's just say that a firm has a budget of $10,000 per month that they want to spend on some form of Google advertising, either an LSA or pay-per-click or both. But let's say they apply that $10,000. If they're in a highly competitive market, which honestly at this point every market is highly competitive, because larger firms from larger metropolitan areas are now competing statewide. So if they have that $10,000 that they're willing to spend, and let's just say for round numbers the cost per click is $100, they're spending $10,000 on 100 clicks. Now you have to get that click to convert into a lead, to convert into a case. And with the cost per case where it is today, realistically, $1,500 per case was the number that was thrown around for so long in pay-per-click, or personal injury firms in particular. But we've passed that number quite a long time ago, in my opinion. I think a more realistic expectation is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,500, $3,000 or more per case, depending on the market.
And you're referring, just for clarity for the audience here, you're referring specifically what a firm would pay to acquire a retainer.
That's right. That's right. So let's say on that $10,000 in ad spend, you might yield 3 to 4 cases in a month. So let's take that same $10,000 and apply it to local services ads. Because it is a pay per lead model, and let's, again, for round numbers, say that the cost per lead is $100, which would be pretty consistent with what we've seen in some of the more competitive markets. Now you're getting, instead of $100 per click, you're getting $100 per leads. You're clearly generating more leads there on that $10,000 in ad spend, and in our experience so far, these leads are converting at a much higher rate than pay-per-click leads. So, we're not saying that we are opposed to pay-per-click. We know that we can still, run campaigns that will be successful for those firms that are willing to take that risk. But I think when you're talking about, if I've got X number of dollars to spend, where is the likely best result in terms of generating leads and cases? Now, kind of to the point about the risk, spending $10,000 in pay-per-click and spending $10,000 on local services ads are two entirely different things. And what I mean by that is sometimes it can be difficult to spend $10,000 a month in local services ads, depending on a variety of factors, which is a completely separate topic. But, to get $10,000 worth of leads in a month for local services ads is not always easy. But if you do, and I think this kind of goes back to the point of mitigating the risk, if you do get $10,000 worth of leads, that's quite a few leads. And I think out of that, you're going to wind up yielding more cases.
Have you seen a commonality just in conversion rate between the two? If you're going to spend $10,000 in pay-per-click and spend $10,000 in local services ads, what should you expect specifically conversion rate on signing the client?
Yeah. So, and again, difficult to make an apples to apples comparison on that same $10,000 because I think spending $10,000 on local services ads is much more challenging. But from a conversion rate standpoint, and if we're talking about, and when we say conversion rate, if what we're talking about is for every lead or every 10 leads, how many cases are coming out of that. I think what we're seeing is conversion rates on local service ads leads are typically going to be anywhere from 2 to 3 times higher than what we would experience on pay-per-click.
And that's an important piece for anyone advertising. Obviously, you have to look at, lead volume, lead flow is great. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of how many you're actually signing from that time your intake team is spending in working through those leads and working to convert. So that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key to that for any firm is make sure that you're tracking that, right? Not difficult to do through either pay-per-click or local services ads, but every firm should have a good handle on exactly which leads are coming from which platform, and then which of those leads are turning into cases.
Any tips or tricks for our audience that you've experienced on the local services ads?
Quite a few, and Google presented this product to be almost a DIY for law firms, for any service provider that can use local services ads. While it is certainly not nearly as complex as running a pay-per-click campaign, it still requires quite a bit of hands-on. Our team has daily checklists for all of our campaigns. If you really want to keep up with the campaign, it requires constant tweaking of budgets and location. A few things that I would suggest, I think just kind of top level. One of the things that Google prioritizes in determining whether they're going to show your ad and in what position, we would refer to as ad rank. One of the things they prioritize is responsiveness. They want to make sure that not only are you answering the phone, but then that you're taking those leads and you're moving them through their dashboard, and you're updating that status into either archived or booked, for example. So I think being responsive, making sure you're never missing any of those calls come through local services ads is definitely a key to a successful campaign.
Very helpful. Anything else on the local services ads that you think's worth mentioning or sharing?
Well, I do think as I said earlier, that's a topic in and of itself, that we could spend quite a bit of time on. We're constantly learning, as a team at Consultwebs through the dozens of campaigns that we're running throughout the country, as to essentially what buttons to push, to get success from a campaign. I do think, targeting is important. At this time, we're targeting statewide with our campaigns because essentially there's no downside to it. The worst thing that's going to happen is if your office is located in a metro area across the state, there's no harm in targeting the other side of the state, because the worst thing that's going to happen is Google just simply won't show your ad. In which case you're not paying for it, you're not paying for leads. So, that would be, kind of another recommendation is, set your targeting to statewide to the extent that you're willing to take leads and cases from across the state.
I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit for us, Matt. We've talked about this constant evolution of search, and not only is Google evolving how they're displaying search results or even ranking search results with respect to both the ads and the organic and the maps results. That's all fluctuating on an ongoing basis. We experienced a pretty major December 2021 local update that many in the industry are deeming the vicinity update, which has been, powerhouse for some firms, and it's been a total doomsday for other firms. So obviously these are constantly shifting, but I want to touch about the overall landscape of not just search, but the web. And Google refers to this, as I've heard you talk about, as the messy middle. So can you talk about what is the messy middle and why does it even matter to an advertising lawyer?
Yeah, and maybe some of our listeners have heard this concept of the messy middle thrown around by Google, and really what they're referring to here is kind of it's a theory as to the buyer's journey, and the buyer's journey is nothing new in marketing and advertising. It's a concept that has been part of marketing and advertising really from the beginning, and it's evolved. And the various models that are kind of in vogue at any given time tend to vary. And a lot of folks might be familiar with essentially the sales funnel model, right, for the buyer's journey. So if we envision the top of that sales funnel being sort of the brand awareness, this is where consumers are becoming aware of a product or service, and then as they move down that funnel, with the bottom of the funnel being purchase, the goal is to move that buyer or follow that buyer throughout that journey, all the way from awareness, or what Google refers to as the trigger, all the way to the bottom of the funnel, which would be the purchase. And Google's contention, which I tend to agree with, in today's digital landscape, that funnel is no longer quite so nice and neat or linear as it once was. And what we have is, kind of at the top, we have this trigger, which in the case of our clients, mostly personal injury firms, that trigger is going to be a life-changing event. It's going to be an accident or some type of incident that requires the buyer or the prospect to consider hiring an attorney. And then at the bottom of that, we have the purchase, that's the point at which they decide to sign with a lawyer. What we're now left with is this messy middle. And we've talked about this internally for quite some time, and I think Google has really explained it in kind of a nice, neat way. But their point is that it's not nice and neat anymore. If we imagine the trigger at the top, the precipitating event at the top, and then that purchase at the bottom, what we're left with in the middle essentially looks like spaghetti. It's all over the place. And I know that's been one of the frustrations with a lot of our clients at a lot of law firms around the country, which is people are everywhere. Our attention spans are so short, and our media consuming habits are constantly evolving and are continuously fragmented. How in the world do we possibly gain any traction, when we're trying to walk prospective client through that buyer's journey? And it certainly is a challenge. And I think, for us, we have a couple of top level recommendations and things to keep in mind when you're trying to drive that, that buyer through that today's buyer's journey. And really, it starts with what we would consider to be outside of that model from trigger to purchase, right? It's very important for firms, as important today as ever, for firms to build brand recognition or exposure prior to that precipitating event. Personal injury firms, law firms in general, are not selling consumer packaged goods than if you're selling, a particular widget. So that makes it challenging. When any given person is in need of your services is highly unpredictable. So that makes it challenging. So I think for those reasons, it's just as important today as it's ever been to grow that brand recognition and that exposure so that when that prospective client does enter into, the modern buyer's journey from that triggering event down to purchase, you already have a built-in advantage because you've had that exposure, you've had those touch points, so that at any given point, when the buyer jumps out of this sort of iterative process in the messy middle, it's a combination of exploration and evaluation that goes on, right? It's the exploration the part of the prospective client or buyer of what are my options, right? What law firms are out there that could help me with this problem? And then it's a constant, series of evaluation. You've explored, you've started to narrow down your list of potential firms, and now you're evaluating them, right? So how do we capture them in that exploration process? Well, that, Tanner, goes to your point earlier about search, right? Search is as important as ever. We already talked about two components to a search engine page, and that's going to be local services, ads, and pay-per-click. Obviously, organic search, being in the maps. Those things are all very important in that exploration stage, while a buyer is trying to figure out who are their options. What are their options in terms of law firms that can help them in their market? So having that presence there is extremely important. And then the evaluation, starts turning into your reviews, not only on Google, but on other services such as Yelp, Facebook, anywhere that a review can be left. I think it's important for firms to try to have a presence there, because reviews, online reviews, that's the modern day version of talking to your neighbor over the fence, right? I still think that a lot of consumers are turning to friends and colleagues for that evaluation to kind of get that affirmation and their experience with the firm. But really, online reviews have become the modern day version of that, and so that's why I think that's highly important.
Let me point one thing out, and I'll add to that. Reviews, they've been gold. They're going to continue to be gold for businesses. But you can apply that same social proof concept on a website that you control, your website as the law firm, and building in social proof into that site on an ongoing basis. That should never end. Pulling in testimonials, video testimonials, written testimonials, Google reviews, prior verdicts and settlements or prior awards, any kind of recognitions, any kind of awards. These are all social proof that ultimately help exactly what Matt is stressing here with this exploration process and essentially vetting who are my best options or who is my best option.
Absolutely. And, given this messy middle, right, this big jumbled mess of spaghetti that we're talking about, when a buyer is looking for that social proof or that that validation in the evaluation process, it's not consistent. They move back and forth between exploration and evaluation constantly. So any opportunity that you have to provide them with that with that information on during the evaluation stage is critical. And as Tanner said, that often starts with your website. And I think another thing that makes this challenging is that, prospective buyers can jump from any one of these stages into purchase at any given time. With the consumer packaged goods industry, for example, for years there was this bell curve of frequency. If we know that if we deliver a frequency of 4.1, that's the optimal frequency, and that's what's likely to drive the user to purchase. Any frequency beyond that, you get diminishing returns. Really, those hard, fast rules are out the window. And I think that's partly because our attention spans are so much shorter. So there's fewer opportunities for really significant long-term engagement that's going to drive somebody to purchase. And, where we're spending time online is so fragmented. I think it's more important to strive for a plan. Oftentimes we'll hear clients calling in to our law firms and saying, it seems like you guys are everywhere. That's music to our ears. That's what we want to hear. How do we accomplish that? It's a number of different factors. Number one is to have a very versatile and diverse portfolio of digital advertising. You can't be everywhere, literally. It's just too large of a universe, online universe, to try to dominate. But I think it's important to be diverse, and then I also think it's important to the extent possible, utilize remarketing and retargeting technologies so that the user gets that impression that you're everywhere. So wherever they are in that buyer's journey, and I'll give you an example. Let's just say that somebody's in a motor vehicle accident and they wind up going to the claims page of their auto carrier, Geico, State Farm, whomever. A sound strategy for us would be, we're trying to target users through digital advertising who have been to pages like the claims page of State Farm, right? So that buyer, they've been in that accident. Maybe they've already conducted a search for a personal injury firm and they're in that exploration phase and they look at a few firms and maybe even go to your website. Then later on that day, they need to deal with their insurance company. So they go to that State Farm, claims page, for example. Once they've been there, our system is going to recognize they've been there and we're going to hit them with an ad. So now you've had an opportunity for an additional touch point, right? And you're starting to create that feeling, as creepy as it might seem to some people, but I think we're all used to it at this point. You're starting to create that feeling that you're everywhere. And that's really the goal, is to make sure you're getting as many touch points, as many impressions in front of that potential buyer when they're inside of that circle in that process from trigger event to purchase. And along the way, all of your advertising, all of your touch points, as I said before, at what point in that process any particular buyer decides to move to purchase has become very unpredictable. So all of your advertising marketing has to have that call to action and that ability for the user, for the potential buyer, to go from the exploration and evaluation straight to purchase, and that would be contacting the law firm.
Well, I see how lawyers who understand this, who hear it and get it, they hear this and they're like, we're going to embrace this messy middle. Let's find a way. Let's feed consumers with the information that they are truly looking for in this exploration and evaluation process and this constant going back and forth. In fact, we don't have time to get into it, but Google has invested in a number of studies. But I want to point out one factor that I see in this. This is the elephant in the room. Attribution gets thrown out of the window. Attribution with respect to what is the one-to-one from my individual marketing dollar here? What is this getting me versus my individual dollar over here? What is it getting me? How do law firms address that topic?
An excellent point, Tanner, and was really going to be kind of my final takeaway. So to your point, that final attribution, I've been saying for quite some time that we as digital marketers have almost dug our own grave to some extent, because everything that we do, every platform that we advertise on, we do have the ability to measure directly from that ad to the website to a conversion to a case. We have the ability to measure that. Unfortunately, that path is not always linear. In fact, it's rarely linear. And I'll give you an example. Let's just say that a firm is running a YouTube advertising campaign. Now, most people are not going on to YouTube to be advertised to by a personal injury law firm. They will use YouTube as a search engine. It's the second largest search engine in the world, right? They will use it that way. And in that case, we can deliver them an ad if they're looking for personal injury lawyers. But for the most part, they're there to watch videos on something completely unrelated to personal injury. Nonetheless, they're delivered an ad. That user is not likely to disrupt their viewing experience, the reason why they were on YouTube in the first place, to interact with that ad and go to the law firm's website and turn into a lead into a client right then and there. It's rare. We're set up to do it, right? Technically, it is possible. What's more likely is we've caught that buyer, that prospective client, somewhere in this messy middle that we've talked about. We've shown them that ad, and whether it's subconscious or not, now they have some recognition of this law firm. And then at some point, they may be on Facebook and they see another impression or another ad from that same law firm. Then they go in and they conduct a search for, car accident lawyer near me, for example. Now we're showing them a local services ad, a pay-per-click ad. They've got strong organic ranking. And so at that point, maybe they decide to convert. Maybe they just decide to come into the website for a little while and browse around, in which case we're going to, attach a cookie to their browser and we're going to retarget them on Facebook again later. And maybe at that point, later that night, when they've had their fifth or sixth interaction with that law firm, they use that Facebook ad to convert. So the question becomes, who gets the credit, right? Is it
the chicken or the egg?
Right. Is it the local services ad that they saw and scrolled past, or the PPC ad, or the organic result that they clicked on to go in and browse around, or is it the first YouTube video that they saw? So that would be, my primary takeaway there for law firms is, yes, we as digital marketers can track data to the extreme degree, and you can assign metrics to just about anything you want. But I would caution, if you have a well-balanced digital advertising portfolio, as we've discussed, just be very careful about throwing away campaigns because you don't see what you think is a one-to-one attribution of that campaign to leads and cases, because the role of each campaign is not always direct response, even if it has the capability to convert direct response. And so that would be my caution. I think the smart advertisers that we work with have figured out a long time ago that the metric that really matters to them most is overall leads and cases. And if what you're doing from an advertising standpoint continues to drive more leads, more cases, then you're investing in the right places. So, that would be kind of my big primary takeaway, is just be careful of the metrics, that you don't get too hung up on the weeds in some of those campaigns. Video advertising being a prime example, right? We can measure exactly how long somebody has watched a YouTube video, what percentage of the people watched it, 25%, 50%, whatever it might be. I think there are important metrics to be gleaned from a campaign like that, right? Total watch time. You can get thousands of hours worth of video watch time from a YouTube campaign for a fraction of the cost of what it would cost you to get that same watch time on television. Does that necessarily mean that campaign is driving more direct leads and cases than your TV campaign? Not necessarily. But what we do know is that even if a user doesn't follow that direct path from YouTube to website to lead to case, we have clients all the time tell us that callers will say, when asked, how did you hear about us? They'll say, we saw your videos online. And we know that law firms are getting cases directly from YouTube advertising campaigns, even though we, as the digital advertising agency, can't trace that path directly because, as we said, that user was somewhere in that messy middle. And we don't know if the YouTube video was the first or the 17th thing that prospective client saw that drove them to act. But we do know that it was effective and that they remembered it. And I think that's what's important.
Matt, we appreciate those insights. Was there anything else that you would have wished I would have asked you around this topic?
I think, really what I just wanted to accomplish here today is, kind of give the listeners an idea of, some of the most significant changes to digital advertising as it pertains to law firms. And to your point on the front end, we often joke internally that, what we do is like painting a moving train. It is constantly evolving. That is the one constant, is change, and that's where our job is to stay on top of that change. And I think as much as anything, as per our discussion with local services ads, also, look at data on a macro level to really have some meaningful insight as to how it's impacting, law firms in their marketing.
For those who may have questions around this topic, what's the best way for them to reach out to you, Matt?
Email always works well for me. You can reach me at msmyers, that's MSMYERS, at consultwebs.com. My contact information is also on our website. So feel free anytime anyone has any questions. Obviously, I love talking about this stuff, so I always welcome those conversations.
Matt, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Tanner. Great to be here.
Lawsome by Consultwebs with Tanner Jones. For show notes, links, and info, go to consultwebs.com/podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Watch for the next Lawsome episode to discover more breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm.